This episode is a very raw one for me to chime in on. Now, I wanted and decided to go into this because of a few reasons. One in particular, I'm now on the board of this nonprofit in London, and I have been a fan of their work and followed the work and engaged with the work of Innocence for years. Back when I lived in LA, I used to go to many fundraisers that the San Diego Innocence Project had and try and participate to my best ability. But that being said, on the other side of this, there is so much trauma behind this story. And so I'm going to try and really actively get through this without crying, but it may be the first time I cry on camera. No promises. That being said, before I get into this episode, I want to preface this by saying this is my experience with the justice system. This is a raw conversation that includes a lot of trauma. So if this particular topic in general triggers you, etc., please reach out to anyone you need to following this episode, myself included, if you have questions. But it does really talk about trauma. And another reason that I feel so inclined at this point in my life, after having not spoken about this for pretty much my whole career, to talk about this now is because the place that I'm in my career at 26, I would not be in if my dad had not been locked up when I was 7. And the work that this organization does and the people that they've helped exonerate, I just want everyone to know about it. And I think that there's some people who wake up every day and they want to be rich and they want to be famous. And I think there's some people who wake up every day, myself included, and hopefully anyone watching this, who really want to change the world. And for me, that is pretty much the whole mission behind my company and being fearless, is that I had 2 paths I could have gone down when my dad was locked up. One that could have been completely destroying my life, and the other one doing something in hindsight, unexpectedly, that would have made me into the person that I am today and given me the platform that I have. So I'm going to walk back to the beginning of this story because I actually think, even from an outside perspective, I mean, this story is quite fascinating. So when I was 7, my father was wrongfully convicted and put in maximum security in Cranston, Rhode Island. I spent 5 years of my childhood visiting him. Now, back in 2007, there was no requirement for police stations to record interrogation rooms. So in the 24 hours that my dad was interrogated, he signed 2 false confessions. What does that mean? It means that in a state of duress and in a state of complete mental not well-being, he signed that he committed 2 crimes that he did not commit. Walking back the story a bit further, I grew up in a super small town in eastern Connecticut. I always say I grew up with no money and no connections, but my dad used to be a very successful salesperson. We were not like a rich family at all, but I think we did good as a family. I think as a young kid, I always showed signs that perhaps I was a bit different. I do remember from the beginning, like teachers saying things and whatnot. But we had a normal upbringing. My parents were not married. My mom had been married before. So it's just a super small town I grew up in. And my parents weren't married. My dad actually did not live with us. He lived in another town called Vernon, Connecticut, closer to where he worked. But he was at my house every night. It was just a normal, what you'd expect from like an immigrant mom and regular dad. At the young age that I was, right, when this happened to my dad, I mean, sure, I think I was a bit different, but like, was I blogging? Was influencing a thing? No. Did I have stage parents? No. But at that point, I really thought I would be a successful actress. So it's funny because I don't even sometimes remember what happened yesterday, but that 5 years of my life, I can almost remember every single moment of it. And I think anyone who has experienced trauma may also resonate with it. I mean, there's just things that don't leave your mind. There's just things that are almost too traumatic that you wish they would. And some memories do fade or nightmares do fade, but some stay very present. I remember my mom one time on the phone, like this was the beginning of what happened here. And by interviewing also today a lawyer from Innocence, I interview him because I want to bring validation to this. I think a lot of people may think, of course, you're going to say your dad didn't commit those crimes, but my dad didn't commit the crimes. And people are going to prison every single day who did not commit crimes. And so that was why I felt so inclined to not only join the board of this nonprofit, but use this platform to spread awareness and also interview a lawyer before you guys watch this particular story that I'm sharing, because I want to prove to you how severe this justice system, the problems that it encompasses, are. So I remember my mom, she was a nurse. She came home from work, and I remember, it's so crazy. I mean, I was 7, so it's so wild to think back on this, but I remember asking my mom, like, where's dad? And then I remember she called a friend, a childhood friend of mine who lived, I grew up in a condo, my friend Claire's mom. And I remember I went over to Claire's and I slept over there. And then the next day, I remember coming home, and I just remember a bit of a frenzy. And I remember it all happening very fast. And when you're a little kid and you're going through these motions and these experiences, I don't know that of course I didn't know what was happening, but no one knew what was happening. What ended up transpiring is my dad walked into a hotel in Vernon, Connecticut. He was an undiagnosed diabetic. For anyone who isn't familiar with diabetes, if you become, or your blood sugar goes too low as a diabetic, you can almost become schizophrenic. And I've seen this with my father. If he doesn't eat, like, his diabetes is so severe, and it's so sad because it's such a debilitating disease, and I wish more people talked about it, because I feel so much pain for my dad sometimes, all the time, quite frankly. But I feel a lot of pain for him and for anyone young, especially who is a diabetic. He was an unannounced diabetic, and he walked into a hotel in Connecticut, Vernon, Connecticut, and the guy at the front desk had a photo of someone who was going from Rhode Island to Connecticut to New Jersey, I think, exposing himself and things with kids, like all of the worst stuff. So instead of calling the police, now my dad walked into this hotel to make a phone call on the phone at the hotel. I think his blood sugar was kind of getting low, and he just unfortunately walked into the wrong place at the wrong time. So he walks into this place. The guy at the front desk had a sketch of this said man who was exposing himself and doing these things to kids across these states. Calls up the police. The police roll in. Over the next 24 hours, my dad is held in a room in the Vernon police station. He is interrogated, and he is coerced into signing 2 false confessions that to this day he has no recollection of signing. Now, the 2 false confessions put my dad in the places of where these crimes occurred. However, he was not at those places. Where the first crime occurred, my dad had actually signed into the gym. He went to the gym at the same time every single day for pretty much his whole life up to that. But at this time, there was no photo of somebody walking into a gym in the way that now if you sign into a 24-hour fitness or an Equinox or whatever, there's a photo of you on the screen. It wasn't like that back then. So he was at the gym when this first thing occurred, right? 24 hours, my mom and my dad's friend at the time are calling people up, trying to find where my dad is. And my mom ends up getting in touch with the police station, who says, you can come and find out at a hearing on Monday what your husband has been convicted of. Now, my mom recounts this story like thinking this doesn't make any sense. But all of a sudden it's on the news. So things just started to kind of become very odd. But simultaneously, my dad, 24 hours after, was given that one phone call. He had no idea to ask for a lawyer, like all of those things. And he was so ill in that room when they convinced him to sign those false confessions. So he has no recollection of signing those. Over the next 4 to, I think, 8 weeks, my family, now, again, there's very little money there. You know, my dad has family in Houston and he has his parents, but like my mom was just a working mom. I have an older half sister, but she had essentially moved out by the time we have a 16-year age difference. And so I just remember like a lot of confusion and like, where's dad and whatnot. And my mom always just kept saying to me, like, your dad's coming home. He's just late at work. He's just stuck at work for days and days and days. it was winter when this happened. So they ended up getting a lawyer involved who, long story short, was very corrupt. Basically took $100,000 from my family, like all of the money they scrapped together. My mom had another investment property. She had to sell that, like a small home that she owned, to give money to the lawyer. Now, there ends up being this sentencing where my mom and my grandparents at the time and my dad's brothers are able to go and see, like, what the fuck has happened here. Essentially, this guy, who's a normal guy, my dad's a super normal, all-American guy, is just almost picked up and poof, just doesn't come home the next day, right? And so over the weeks, my mom, the thing that I find most interesting about this case that actually makes my body kind of, the hairs on my arms come up when I talk about this part. She knew something was wrong because this didn't make any sense, right? It's very rare that all of a sudden somebody just commits a crime, like no confirmation. He was at the gym. How is this happening? She was at work one day and my mom was a psych nurse and she went to the car afterwards, and there was a piece in the Hartford Courant of a lawyer who was involved with the Innocence Project, who had helped get somebody out of prison in Connecticut for a crime that occurred in New Haven, like on the Yale campus. It was a murder crime. My mom says she called 411 and she said, please connect me to a Donald Connery. And in like a Hail Mary Jesus, the woman on the other end of the line said, I think you mean a Donald Connolly, like I'll connect you now. My mom got connected to this lawyer who was also involved in the Innocence Project. And, you know, Innocence Project lawyers, I mean, they're remarkable. These are lawyers that are doing essentially pro bono work, right? But they come from very esteemed colleges and universities and backgrounds. So you're not just talking about your run-of-the-mill lawyer. I mean, these are the toughest, some of the most esteemed lawyers out there. My mom explained the situation essentially to this random strange man on the phone. Like, I think something's happened to my husband. This doesn't make sense. Like, we need help. And he came and he went. My dad was put into a prison in a holding cell, I think in Rhode Island at this time, essentially awaiting this trial. Donald goes and meets with my dad and I guess spent 7 or 8 hours with him. Went back to my mom and says to my mom, if this goes to trial, verbatim, this is what he said, the most innocent man I have ever met is going to be locked up for life. Like, you have to stop the trial. So in this time frame, right, the cops had essentially orchestrated this making a murderer style situation of my dad had paid somebody to check into the gym. Simultaneously, the week before, my dad had gotten his hair done. That was all because he was planning to go and be in Rhode Island when this first crime happened. It was just this bizarre series of events, and none of it was true. Absolutely none of it was true. And people ask me all the time, you know, did your mom know that he was innocent? And I've asked her this before, and she said, yeah, because it doesn't make sense. You know, and my mom's a very level-headed woman. Had somebody shown her DNA, there was no DNA in this case. There was nothing. There was nothing to go on besides the fact that, unfortunately, under duress, my dad signed 2 false confessions. And that's why talking to Justin, a lawyer, about this, it's wild to hear him say, as a lawyer, oh, people sign false confessions all the time. It happens all of the time, and there's no coming back from it. So what I remember is because my mom didn't have any help for me, she had to bring me to a lot of the trial like stuff and the court cases. And I remember this part I don't want to talk about because I'm going to cry. Like, yeah, I can't talk about this stuff. I remember like the first time, like when you go and you like the trial, and I remember just being like a young kid and hearing some of these things. And then I remember for sure the first time I like stepped foot in a jail, because my dad, we were living in Connecticut, but these crimes, some of them have occurred in Rhode Island. So he essentially had to go to Rhode Island and either potentially await this trial, which we ended up not having the trial, but he was in Rhode Island. So Cranston, Rhode Island is about an hour and a half away from where I'm from. It's also where Olivia Culpo is from. Mike Studd, I think, is from Cranston. Maximum security prison in Cranston, Rhode Island is awful. It is awful. Prison is a terrible place. Being a kid in prison is a terrible place for a kid to be. I remember, my dad is my best friend to this day. The reason I work so much is because my dad he's my everything. He is my everything. And when I think about strength and when I think about hope, It's unbelievable to me what humans can endure, but just the fact that this can happen to somebody is what makes me so emotional about this topic. But yeah, essentially, I spent years visiting him in this prison. Uh, my dad ended up taking a plea bargain. And I asked him, actually, we were in Maine a few weeks ago, and we very rarely talk about this. And when I asked my dad things, I think he's forgotten a lot of it. I think that kind of trauma and pain is too much to endure. But I asked him, why did you take the plea bargain? Because he could have gone to trial. And hopefully, you would think that if you go to trial and you didn't commit the crimes, you won't go to prison. And he said to me, they ended up getting a lawyer who found out there was too much damage that was done. The original lawyer had not presented proper facts about my father. And because of that, the damage that was done, and that lawyer they ended up finding out was a cocaine addict. This is insane. Cocaine addict wanted so much money up front, was actually not even a criminal defense lawyer. I guess he was like a divorce lawyer that my uncle had found online in Texas, but he was in Connecticut, the lawyer. The whole thing is insane. So his options were you either sit trial, and of course, anyone convicted on those types of crimes, we're not talking like some weed in your pocket. We're talking about the epitome of what most people expect people in prison to be, pedophiles and serial killers and etc. You're not getting home. You're not coming home. And my dad's diabetes was progressing so much at that point. And so I asked him, why did you take the plea bargain? And he said to me, because your mom said to me, do you ever want to see your daughter again? Like, he literally said, there wasn't much for me to think about, but it was I either go to trial and I'm gone for life, or I take the plea bargain and I'll be home in 5 years. And I think maybe he got out with good time in 4.5. And in that time, the year that he got out is the year that I started my blog. And the reality of this situation is the things that I saw in prison, I mean, the amount of money that it costs for even somebody to be in prison, the phone calls. I mean, my dad is just like literally the coolest guy ever. But when the system wrongs you to this degree, it doesn't just wrong the person, it wrongs the family. There's another organization I volunteered with when I was living full-time in LA called POPS. And it's a lot of kids whose parents, it's all kids actually, whose parents have been incarcerated. And I think from the kids' side, right, like it doesn't matter if your parent is innocent or not innocent. Of course, in the matter of life and family, yes, that matters, and it also kind of decides sometimes how long you'll go away for. But on the child side, when you have a parent who has been incarcerated, there is nothing for you. There's no money. For the most part, you're talking about kids who come from low income homes, who come from very little. I grew up in a, I guess, middle class household in Eastern Connecticut, a very rural town. But so you don't expect this really to happen to me, right? But like when I tell you, and it's so funny, you know, and I think the running thing for me, for those who don't know, I was pretty heavily canceled online in April for accidentally, at the time I didn't know, abandoning a marathon. When I realized how easy it is to judge somebody, the comments about me being this rich white girl from Connecticut, and I'm like, you guys have no idea. Like, you have no idea what I've seen. The things that I've seen in my life, sure, it's one thing I moved out at 16 and I was living in New York, but like I grew up in a maximum security prison. DCF tried to take me away so many times. They interrupted so many classes when I was in middle school because they just were desperate to get me out of the hands of my terrible mother, because that's what the state was telling them. This is a kid who father's been locked up, and you can never see that you're innocent. You can't say that you're innocent. So that's why he took the plea bargain. But they actually would take me out of classes, and I remember this clearly, and DCF would interrogate me because my mom, and I give my mom so much credit, I mean, quite frankly, she is the reason that if she hadn't read that newspaper article, my dad would have gone away for life. We would have had no idea about a plea bargain and trial, how to stop that. But she was so adamant about trying to get this story out, and the story of what had happened to my dad and that he was wrongfully convicted, that she got it on the front page of the Hartford Courant. And that almost kind of backfired because, and it's so crazy actually, Disney for a second actually rejected my show. You guys don't know this story, but they actually rejected my show originally when I was in LA and had moved there for this show. They said yes, then they said no. They said no, and they ghosted me for 6 months. And I love you guys. I love everyone at Disney. But in that period of time, I thought they had ghosted me because they had found this article about my dad online. And I was so angry at my mom because I said, like, you didn't think in that moment that my future would be impacted by you trying to get attention out for what had happened to dad. And I remember my mom saying to me, like, look, I'm so sorry. And if Disney says no to this show, I'm so sorry. But I thought your dad was going to die in prison for something he didn't do. I had no idea what to do. So my mom got it plastered on the front page of the largest newspaper in Connecticut, and there was a whole kind of expose on it. And I remember the photographer coming, and I remember everyone at school making comments about it. And I'm from such a small town, so the bullying because of that, it was awful. It was awful. And my mom, and it was a whole article about him being wrongfully convicted. But number one, when you're from a small town, people don't believe that stuff. And number two, it's very hard. Now people are more aware about it. But you have to think back then, Kim Kardashian was not helping people in prison. Making a Murderer was not out. Netflix was not a thing. And because of that, people would say to me, it doesn't make sense that your dad would go to jail for something he didn't do. That's not possible. And it's wild because of how much the times have changed, and Obama passing that law in 2014, that if that law had been passed when my father was put in that room, that interrogation room, on whatever day it was, February something in 2007, this never would have happened. This never would have happened because you would have seen that he was coerced into signing a false confession under duress, as so many people are. Unfortunately, Obama was not in office then. He didn't pass that law until, I think, 2014, 3 or 4 years after my dad being let out of prison. But to back that up, I mean, DCF, I remember being interrogated and trying to have to explain and comprehend this article. I remember my mom, like, coaching me on some of these things, but it's awful. In a way, I can say that, like, I was a kid who went through the system. I didn't go through it in that way, but I went through it in another way. I went through situations with DCF. I went through experiences with the prison. I mean, prison is a terrible place, and it's not like low security prison. This was maximum security prison in Rhode Island. Like, think about that for a second. I saw what you guys see on TV, you know? It's crazy when I think back about it, and the guards and the security and the vending machine. And I always just remember thinking, like, it was the best part for me of going to this prison was the fact that I would get sugar, and my mom would let me have anything from the vending machine. And I just remember that was like the only thing that got me through it. And when I was in Maine a few weeks ago with my dad, and I said to him, like, how do you get through something like this? You have to present and be alive for the rest of your life, and then you get out and your life is over. And he said, you accept the cards that you're given. Like, when this kind of thing happens to you, you have no choice. You accept the cards that you've been handed, and those were the cards he had been dealt. Brittany Griner was actually interviewed in the New York Times, and I loved the piece. She said something similar, and now she wasn't wrongfully convicted. But of course, anyone who comes from, a semi-normal background, and all of a sudden now you're in jail, and she's in jail in Russia, she said something very similar. She said, you just accept that this is your life now. And she never thought she was getting out. And she said the same thing. You accept that this is your life now. And prison is a terrible place. It is a terrible place, and it is meant for terrible people. And that's not what happened here. So, anywho, my dad got out about 4.5 years later on that plea bargain. And I grew up kind of alone. I will say, my mom had to work so much. She was a single parent. Now my dad is gone. There's no second income. She worked a lot. And I think when people ask me always the time, like, how are you so mature at 26? I did move out at 16 at a really young age. But, I mean, I grew up really alone. Like, my sister was gone. It was kind of just me. I mean, I spent a lot of time at home alone and having to do my own thing and find my own way. And that is how blogging became my outlet. So the year that my dad got out is the year that I started my blog, and that's why I have this tattoo on my finger. That's the reason I started this blog, is because I didn't have anything else. There was nothing else for me. And I think, when you're given that kind of set of statistics, when you're given that set of a decision or a path in life, right? And simultaneously, I'm failing out of school. I'm so bad at it. I knew at a young age, like, I just didn't want to be a statistic, if that makes sense. Like, I knew what I had gone through was so traumatic and so awful. And I'm so angry, right? And I'm still so angry. I won't deny it. I'm angrier than my dad is. I can tell you that. Um, but I didn't want to be a statistic for a kid who was this effed up kid who had seen a lot of stuff at a really young age and was defined by it from her life. And so when my dad got out, when you get out of prison, even if you're innocent or not innocent, you're essentially just thrown on the street. He couldn't live with us because we lived near kids. And with that kind of an offense, you can't live near kids. He went from this lucrative sales job to, I think he makes 20, 30,000 a year now. And he is just the happiest guy. Like, he's like literally my best friend. But I think like it's crazy to me because it keeps happening, right? Like, my dad in this scenario is one situation, but this keeps happening to people all over the world. And the kids are like really who I feel for, because of the fact that like you go through this process and the kid has to come along almost for the ride, watching their family member essentially die in prison. Then the family member gets out and it should be okay, you're moving on. You can't move on. You can't move on from that because there's no help, there's no assistance, there's no financial, there's no one to talk to. I mean, who does, like, what does my mom do? Call up her friends and be like, oh, great, my husband's home now, who just went to jail for 5 years for doing nothing. Like, let's proceed on. You can't. You almost leave prison and in a sense, you're kind of locked up in this cage again. And so I just want people to know that in life, you have two paths you can go down. What happened to my family? And I was 1% of this equation, right? Like, I don't feel sorry for myself. I feel only emotions for my dad. But I do feel very sad for what the justice system does to people and how corrupt it is. And maybe this would never have happened now because of all the laws that have been passed, but it's still happening to other people. So I just want to urge anyone who's gone through anything to know that you can rewrite your narrative. Every single time something happens to you, it's up to you to rewrite it. Like, no one was telling me to start a blog. No one was telling me to be an entrepreneur. Absolutely nothing. It was 100% on me to make sure that I wasn't a statistic, and I did that. And I am living proof. Like, I love that about myself. I'm really a chameleon. Like, I can be at a Motel 6 and then I can be at a Four Seasons. I can be at the best party in the world and I can also live at home in sweatpants. And I say that in a way that's like, because of what I've gone through, I am able to so easily read people and adjust myself in so many situations. Had this not happened to me, I would never have started that blog. Would I give all of it up to not have it happen to my dad in a heartbeat? In a heartbeat. In a heartbeat. Like, there is no doubt about it. No doubt about it. And I always think, actually, about the Kardashians. I always think, wow, would they want their dad back who passed if in return they had to be normal? I don't know their answer, but I can tell you in a heartbeat I would give it all up for this to not have happened to my dad. But at the end of the day, it happened. And something may happen to you in your life. It may happen to your family, but it is up to you to choose how you want to proceed. And that is something I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you that in life you have two choices, two paths you can take, and you always have to choose the one that's the better one. The other one it's useless, right? Like, there's nothing good about letting yourself be defined by that trauma. There's no point in it. It's completely useless, I can tell you looking back. You can't be defined by the set of statistics that you were given. You have to rewrite your narrative and you have to rewrite your story. And that's what I did. And that's what I continue to do. And I hope that this story, and I didn't even really get into the nitty gritty of it. It's a bit too deep, to be honest. I really didn't get into the nitty gritty of it. But really, another takeaway is really, if you need a nonprofit, if you need an organization, if you need a reason to wake up in the morning, Innocence is that organization. It is my heart and soul. Like, if I wasn't an entrepreneur, I'd be a lawyer, and I plan hopefully one day to go to law school. And so I hope that Any of you who maybe feel inspired by this, or perhaps you want to go to law school, that is an option for you. Remember that. And you have to stay fearless. Stay fearless. Don't let anything define you, and constantly get out of your comfort zone. So I forgot to, in that last episode, actually, when I went home, I remembered a few other things that I probably should have said. One question in particular that many people ask me, which is, how is my dad doing now? So when my dad got out of prison, you feel like you're free, and actually it was quite the opposite. So because my mom lived with kids, they put him in a halfway house. Now we're talking about an educated college degree, formerly very successful person, and they essentially just threw him on the street, right? I mean, the justice system is so disappointing. But how to sum it up? I mean, my dad went from making a good amount of money a year to my dad probably makes $20,000 or $30,000 a year now, to be totally honest. He is the hardest worker that I know. But I just think it is crazy to me that this happened. When I think of resilience and when I think of grit and when I think of getting through the trials and tribulations of life, that's my dad. But at the end of the day, when people ask, like, how is he doing now? I mean, I guess the best that anyone could do who went through that. It was a terrible thing that happened to him. It was a terrible thing that happened to my mom and I. And you do the best that you can, but he'll never have a normal job again. He'll never be able to provide for his family like he was able to do when I was younger. And like I said throughout that episode, I mean, my dad is just the strongest, smartest guy, and I'm so proud to know him. But really, the only way to answer that question is to say that it has been consistently difficult, and I think he's moved on maybe more than I have. But the real question is, whatever these crimes were, right? Who actually committed them? My mom has her own theories. She has one that the girl who it happened to in Newport, Rhode Island when she was 7, who also picked my dad out of a lineup. And lineups are very notorious for spinning people in the wrong direction, that it was her dad because of evidence that came out further along in this situation that suggest that. Was there really anyone that had done these things? Was this a bizarre strain of events where it got out of control and someone was in the wrong place at the wrong time? I have no idea. But to this day, and with all these other cases, right, wrongfully convicted people are the ones who are held accountable for crimes where in reality there's somebody else potentially out there who actually did these. And it's almost like at that point the crime has gone cold. Like when the cops put somebody else and lock somebody else away and they never take the energy or the effort to find somebody, it's crazy. So I don't know how to answer that question. I have no idea if the person is out there. I know it wasn't my dad, but unfortunately, my dad was the one who was held accountable for crimes that he didn't commit. So maybe, and is this something that happens with tons of other wrongfully convicted people? Probably. A lot of times, somebody wrongfully convicted will go to prison, and years later, they'll find out that, of course, it wasn't that person, but that it was somebody else. In this particular case, I feel like with my dad's, they closed it. I don't necessarily think that anything else would come out. It wasn't like a murder case or anything, but at the end of the day, my dad signed those false confessions. He will never be able to be fully free of that because unfortunately, in the state of mind that he was in, he signed that. But yeah, that's the only way I can answer it. So like the part one of saying, how is he doing now? How would you do if you went to jail for 5 years, had to get out on a plea bargain and say that you committed a crime? Your whole life is destroyed and you essentially have to rebuild, but you're rebuilding now as a convicted felon. How would you be able to handle that? And then the second of all is, I don't know with these crimes. I don't know how much other research goes into who finds the proper person, but I think for the most part, when that case is closed in the eyes of the justice system, it's closed. Unfortunately, there's no other real way to rebound from the damage that's done in a wrongfully convicted case. If you want to find out more about Innocence Project and my work with Innocence Project London, plus the entire team, Lisa, Nuala, Louise, who work on the Innocence Project, board in the UK, please head to the show notes. Like I mentioned earlier, this nonprofit is so close to my heart. It is essentially the reason that I do what I do. And I really look forward to being involved with many more conversations surrounding innocence in the future. And if you are looking for a cause to get involved with, maybe this is the one that will interest you.